How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was balanced on. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Just remind members, as always, to observe social distancing rules in the chamber, when leaving the chamber and in the corridors throughout the Parliament. We're going to turn shortly to FMQs, but first, the First Minister will give us a short statement, bringing us up to date with the COVID figures. First Minister.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. I'll give a very short update today on the statistics that will be published later this afternoon. The total number of positive cases reported yesterday was 1,027. That's 13.5% of people who were newly tested, and the total number of cases now is 35,787. 405 of the new cases are in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, 230 in Lanarkshire, 152 in Lothian and 73 in Ayrshire and Arran. The remaining cases are across the other 7 mainland health board areas. There are currently 377 people in hospital. That is an increase of 58 on the figure I reported yesterday, and it's more than double the figure I reported before First Minister's questions last week. There are 31 people in intensive care. Currently, that's an increase of 3 since yesterday, and I regret to report that in the past 24 hours, 5 deaths were registered of patients who first tested positive in the previous 28 days. The total number of deaths under that measurement is now 2,538, and I offer again my condolences to everyone who has lost a loved one. We'll also shortly publish the latest estimate of the R number. The estimate confirms our view that the R number continues to be above 1, possibly as high now as 1.6. These figures demonstrate again why we announced significant new measures yesterday to get the virus back under control. Full details of the measures announced yesterday are available on the Scottish Government's website. I recognise how hard these restrictions are for individuals and for businesses, the hospitality businesses in particular, which is why we are making financial support available. But these steps are essential to bringing the virus back under control as we go further into the winter period. So I would ask everyone again to stick with these rules. They are hard and painful for all of us, but they are about the protection of life and health. And finally, I would urge everyone again to remember facts. Face coverings, avoid crowded places, clean hands and hard surfaces, keep 2 metres distance and self-isolate and get tested if you experience any of the symptoms of COVID. Thanks for the opportunity to give that update.
Thank you. And I would just remind members that if they wish to ask a supplementary, either online or in the chamber, to press their request to speak buttons as soon as possible. Call question 1, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the First Minister, does it sound credible to forget a meeting at which you learn for the first time that there are allegations of sexual misconduct being levelled against your predecessor and mentor of 2 decades?
First Minister.
You know, I get why people will look at that and raise an eyebrow, but perhaps if I can explain the circumstances, as I did in the evidence that I submitted to the committee 2 months ago, and which I'm very pleased to say was published yesterday. I read a comment actually by somebody yesterday, forgive me, I can't remember which MSP it was, saying surely something like that would be seared on your memory. There is something seared on my memory, and it is actually the meeting that took place some 3 days later, when Alex Salmon himself sat in my own home and gave me the details of the complaints that had been made against him, and also gave me his response to aspects of those complaints. That is what is seared in my memory, and I think most reasonable people would understand that. And, you know, forgive me, Presiding Officer, if that has somehow overwritten in my mind a much more fleeting, opportunistic meeting that took place a few days earlier, then that is just how it is. Can I say I've put my evidence forward? Anybody, not just in this chamber, who I'm sure have already done this, but anybody across Scotland can go onto the Parliament website and read that evidence. It's a full and frank account, and I look forward, if that is not an absurd description to use, to appearing before the committee and answering any questions that anybody has on whatever aspects of that evidence that they want. I've not yet been invited to appear before the committee, and I hope that is sooner rather than later. So I have no difficulty in answering all and any questions as soon as I'm given an opportunity to do so. I'm being completely open about all of this, but in the meantime, I hope people will also understand I've got a really important job to do as well, which is to continue to lead this country as safely as I can through a global pandemic.
Ruth Davidson.
I have read the submission that the First Minister put forward, and in it, her argument for admitting that meeting is that she was having a busy day, that First Minister's questions had taken up her attention, and that this meeting just slipped her mind. And I've looked back at that First Minister's questions, and we ended up talking about the Arctic strategy, which is not something to cause anyone to forget sexual assault allegations. This does not even bear the lightest scrutiny. It is beyond belief. An account has been published of that meeting which the First Minister had with Mr Salmon's former Chief of Staff. Let me read it out. The conversation was around the fact of the complaints without discussing the specifics of them. The account goes on. There was discussion about the investigation, the process of it, the fact it was a civil servant investigation being conducted by civil servants. So I ask again, does a meeting which involves a discussion of the investigation, the process of that investigation, the civil service side of it, and the fact of the complaints against a former First Minister sound to this First Minister like the kind of thing she wouldn't remember?
First Minister.
I do remember the complaints of sexual misconduct. The point I'm making, and have made before and will make again, is that the detail of that was actually given to me 3 or 4 days later by Alex Salmon himself in my house. I sat in the dining room of my own home while he showed me what he was accused of. I was pretty shocked and upset at that at the time, and that is what is seared in my memory. So that is the fact. Other people can decide to give their own evidence. I will give mine, and I will sit before a committee whenever the committee decides to call me, and I will do that on oath, and I will give my account of everything that happened, because I've got nothing to hide in all of this. Now, I make 2 more points to Ruth Davidson. Firstly, I think she possibly has to decide, you know, what it is she is levelling against me. She stood in this chamber last week and appeared to be suggesting that I or my husband or others in the SNP had somehow been involved in a conspiracy against Alex Salmon. Today, we appear to be having some kind of accusation that in some way I was colluding with Alex Salmon. Both of those things are complete nonsense. And I would also say this to Ruth Davidson. Scrutiny of what happened here is absolutely legitimate. It's what the committee is there to do. And as I say, I look forward to giving evidence to that committee. But at the heart of this were complaints that came forward. It was right that they were investigated. In my view, it was right that there was a process that allowed them to be investigated. The Scottish Government made an error in the application of that process, and that is something that the committee is right to scrutinise. But in all of the attempts by Ruth Davidson to find some way of saying that somehow I am in the wrong here, let's not forget what lay at the heart of this. Serious complaints that the government was right to investigate, wrong to make an error in how it did that, but right to investigate and not to cover up or try to cover up in any way those complaints. So let's not forget the people that lie at the heart of this whole sorry saga.
Ruth Davidson.
Presiding Officer, this isn't a trivial matter, and what lies at the heart of this matter is whether there was an abuse of power, and an abuse of power affects every citizen of this country. And I'm afraid the position of the First Minister is just absurd, because I've spent enough time sparring with her here to know that her powers of recall are in good order. And leaving apart the question of precisely who is supposed to have reminded her of a two-person meeting, you have to ask why. Why did the First Minister mislead Parliament by omitting the fact that this meeting ever happened? Why did it take a government staffer being questioned under oath in a court of law for it even to come out? A meeting in her first ministerial office regarding a former First Minister and a civil service investigation, never recorded, never minuted, when the ministerial code is clear that all such meetings conducted without an official present must be passed back for the facts to be recorded. Her defence is that she's only ever acted as head of the SNP. Isn't this sudden memory loss because she didn't want evidence of her involvement as First Minister coming to light?
First Minister.
So now I'm not conspiring against them. Now I appear to be colluding with them again. Abuse of power. Let's cut to the chase here. What happened was that the Scottish Government, in the wake of the Me Too revelations, put a procedure in place to allow any complaints about anybody, regardless of who they are, seniority, political affiliation, to be investigated. I'm sorry, but I think that was the right thing to do. I think that's a good use of power, if that's how you want to describe it. Complaints came forward, and instead of them being swept under the carpet because they would have been inconvenient for my government because of who they were about, the government decided, rightly and properly, to investigate those complaints. It made an error in how it did that, and that is an aspect that the committee is looking at. But, you know, I understand why it may suit some people to say that this is all some great conspiracy. I'm not entirely sure why anybody still in possession of their own critical faculties would see this as anything other than complaints being investigated and everybody trying to do the right thing in very difficult circumstances. Now, I've been open in the evidence I've given, and any member of the public watching who frankly right now is probably a lot more worried about the ongoing COVID pandemic than they are about any of this, but in case there is anybody out there who is not, they can go onto the Scottish Parliament website and read my evidence in full. They can make up their own minds. It also, the evidence takes on the point about the Ministerial Code. The Ministerial Code, the clauses in the Ministerial Code here are intended to prevent a minister having meetings about decisions they are actually taking in government and not declaring them. This was a decision I wasn't involved in. What I was trying to do was protect the confidentiality and integrity of that process. And of course, I've also referred myself to the advisor on the Ministerial Code who will look at that as well. So I've got nothing to hide in this, nothing whatsoever. People can read my evidence, and when the committee decides, and it's up to the committee to ask me to give evidence, I will do that, and I will relish the prospect of doing that, because all sorts of nonsense is being levelled at me on this. I did not choose to be in a position where complaints were made about my predecessor. I didn't choose to be in the position where my government would have to investigate that. We've tried to do the right thing at every stage, to do right by those who brought forward the complaints. The government didn't do right at all stages because it got an aspect of that wrong. But any suggestion that it should just have somehow been covered up or not dealt with properly, I absolutely reject. So when the committee chooses to call me, I'll go into all of the detail. But in the meantime, I am going to get on with the job that I think most people out there want me to do, which is continue to take the tough decisions to get this country through a global pandemic. And finally, and I know Ruth Davidson doesn't like being reminded of this, but I am open to scrutiny, not just by this Parliament, I'm open to scrutiny by the Scottish people. And when I stand before them in an election next year, they can make their judgment on me and in my conduct. They won't get that opportunity with Ruth Davidson because she'll be away by then in the House of Lords.
Ruth Davidson.
And shall we?
Let's give them all the information before then, shall we? Because the SNP appears to be taking people for fools here. We have a chief executive of the SNP sending texts to colleagues calling for pressure to be put on the police and then saying he didn't mean it. We have the First Minister attending meetings about the Salmon case, then omitting them from her diary and claiming she'd forgotten all about it. And we have a Scottish Government willfully obstructing an inquiry by this Parliament and then attacking anyone who points it out. The First Minister's former Health Secretary, Alex Neil, now says that a full judicial inquiry needs to be held into this scandal. Given the secrecy, given the evasion and the unbelievable nonsense coming from the SNP on this matter, doesn't he have a point?
First Minister.
There is a parliamentary inquiry underway that I've given evidence to and that I will sit in front of and give evidence to orally. I will do it under oath. I've got nothing to hide in all of this. I've had 2 years or more of people making accusations about my conduct. It's not my conduct that sparked any of this. I've tried to act in the proper way. If I've made mistakes along the way, then I will say that and people can make their judgments. But I've tried to do the right thing and I will continue to try to do the right thing because I actually believe that when serious complaints are made, that they are properly investigated. I also actually believe that when there are criminal complaints made, it is actually right to say that the police should properly investigate and that the police should answer any questions. That's, I think, what most people would think is right and proper. Proper investigation, proper due process. That is what should happen. I don't know what would have happened in the Conservatives. Maybe these things would just have been swept under the carpet because they weren't convenient politically. But I don't think that would have been the right thing to happen. So I'll answer any and all questions that anybody wants to ask of me on this. But as I say again, I think most people out there right now listening to this exchange, people living with the consequences of COVID, people who might have lost people to COVID, people who are worried about their jobs and their livelihoods, people who probably want to hear me stand and talk about the things we're doing to get this country through COVID will be looking at Ruth Davidson right now and saying, what on earth is she thinking?
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Liz Cameron, the Chief Executive of the Scottish Chambers of Commerce, said, and I quote her, there was a complete and utter lack of consultation with business on yesterday's new restrictions. This, she said, only serves to compound the blows of these restrictions. The STUC has confirmed that there was absolutely no consultation with them, even though they say the Scottish Government's approach has changed. First Minister, it is clear that this is not just about the decision you've taken, it's about the way that you have taken it. All week there were hints that tighter restrictions were coming, and all the while, those set to be most affected by the restrictions were kept in the dark. Businesses have adapted to new rules. Businesses who were stocking their fridges, paying for supplies for 2 weeks of staycation, workers who have followed the guidance to the letter to keep their customers safe and to keep their jobs safe, but now see their jobs on the line. So, First Minister, why did you take this decision without consulting with, sharing the evidence with, and preparing adequate support for those most affected?
First Minister.
The decisions have to be taken by me and the Government. We consult and talk to stakeholders, business, trade unions, other organisations on an ongoing basis. What we also have to do is assess the evidence on a daily basis and take account of the latest evidence before we come to decisions. I do stand every day and update people on the state of our thinking, on the factors we're taking into account and the decision-making process we go through. These are not normal times and these are not normal decision-making processes. And I know how difficult the consequences of these decisions are for businesses and for individuals. I don't expect these decisions to be welcome or popular. They're tough decisions, but they ultimately have to be made by government. And every day right now, and this is my job, I'm not in any way complaining about that, but every day right now we are facing decisions where we literally have lives in one hand and jobs in the other. It's an impossible, almost, balance to strike. We are doing that to the best of our ability. In terms of the financial support for businesses affected by yesterday's announcement, Fergus Ewing has been speaking to stakeholders in the hospitality sector and tourism sector in particular, and we will make announcements, I hope, tomorrow on exactly how the £40 million of support that I announced yesterday will be allocated to businesses. I don't expect anybody out there to be happy with what we are having to do right now, but I do expect decision makers in this Parliament to have an understanding of the context in which we are operating. And these are not normal times. I do not get up in the morning and decide to close pubs for a sort of policy reason. We are in a global pandemic where we are trying to save lives and balance that with the interests of the economy as best we possibly can. And that's the difficult balance we will continue to strike, talking to and consulting as far as possible with different organisations and stakeholders along the way.
Richard Leonard.
Thank you. And look, I get the First Minister did not get up yesterday morning and decide to impose restrictions on pubs, restaurants and other hospitality establishments. It must have taken several days to come to that conclusion, which is why there should have been consultation with the industry and with the trade unions who represent the workforce in that industry. Since the start of this pandemic, we've called on the government to build up testing infrastructure and tracing capacity. And we have done it not to oppose the government, but precisely because we want the government to succeed, because we want new outbreaks to be contained. But every time we raise this, the First Minister has told us that Test and Protect is working well. Until yesterday, when there was finally an admission that the time bought by closing hospitality would allow for another review of the testing strategy. Yesterday, the First Minister finally spoke of, and I quote her, extending testing to more individuals and groups in society who do not have symptoms. We have asked repeatedly for more testing of asymptomatic people. We've asked for testing of incoming travellers, and we have asked for routine testing to be expanded to home care services. So can the First Minister tell us when this will finally be delivered?
Well, before I leave Richard Leonard's first point on consultation, what I said was I don't go up in the morning and deliberately try to do damage to any sector of the economy. But as it happens, the Cabinet met at 8:30 yesterday morning to take the final decisions on what I announced in Parliament this afternoon. We have sought to share our thinking as we've gone, recognising the difficult and abnormal situation we're all in right now. I spoke to Richard Leonard on Monday night with other party leaders to share the state of our thinking at that point, making very clear we hadn't taken final decisions because we were assessing the clinical evidence and taking the advice from our advisors. So these are difficult things, and I don't expect anybody to then just ignore the impact of these decisions. I am acutely aware, literally every waking moment right now, of the impact of decisions I take and the potential impact of decisions that I don't take. It is literally a life and jobs balance all of the time, and I wouldn't wish these decisions on anyone. I accept it's my responsibility. Nobody makes any of us do these jobs, but I literally wouldn't wish these decisions on anyone right now. And I'm trying my best to do them and reach them in the best possible way. I've never claimed to be infallible. I've never claimed that I will not get things wrong substantively or in process. And we try all along to get them better and to do better as we go. And I think that's what people would expect of government at times like this. And on testing, we don't have just have a functioning test and protect system. We have an extremely well-functioning test and protect system. One of the reasons why we have a situation right now, as I reported yesterday, where our estimated prevalence of this virus right now is about 13% of what the peak level was in March. Now, we think it's rising at a rate where it could catch up with that by the end of this month. But that 13% is what we aim now. But I've just given a figure for the tested positive cases, which is over 1,000. Back in March, I think the peak number of test positive cases we ever reported was around 500. The fact that we are reporting so many more cases now is because we are testing so many more people, because we have a well-functioning system. The results that are published weekly of Test and Protect in terms of contact tracing index cases, tracing contacts, they are doing exceptional work. But all of us have to play our part in combating this virus. The kind of restrictions I announced yesterday, which I hate having to announce. You look across the world right now, you look at Ireland, countries like Belgium, France, Germany even. All countries are grappling with these things, and we're doing it to the best of our ability, and I will continue to do that. I do think we want, as we go into this next phase, to have more parliamentary scrutiny and challenge on that. I think that's in the interests of all of us. But nobody should be under any illusions that these are easy decisions, or that there is ever an absolutely right or wrong thing to do.
Richard Leonard.
Thank you. I mean, I have to say, if Test and Protect is working so well, why are a third of people not being contact traced in 48 hours, with many waiting even longer? But let me turn to something else which has happened this week, which I think is important for Parliament to consider. Because whilst we are rightly concerned about further temporary restrictions on all of us, I want to turn to a group of people for whom life has been restricted for months, who live in fear that temporary limitations become permanent limitations. We must not forget these vulnerable people. Theirs has been an untold story of this pandemic until 2 days ago, when the Scottish Human Rights Commission published its impact monitoring report on COVID-19, social care and human rights. It makes for deeply concerning and at times harrowing reading. It tells of services cut or removed with little or no assessment and little or no communication. The Commission received reports of, and I quote, people left in dire situations, being forced to sleep in wheelchairs, unable to get out of bed, unable to wash and dress themselves. The conclusion of the report is that there has been, and I quote, a direct and detrimental effect on people's rights. The report makes 24 recommendations, amongst which is that care and support services must be restored to pre-pandemic levels. First Minister, it is the responsibility of government to ensure that people's rights, including their human rights, are upheld. So what guarantee can you give that social care services will be restored to at least pre-pandemic levels? When will people see their support packages returned in full? And when will you uphold the human rights and the dignity of those most vulnerable members of our society?
First Minister.
In everything we do, we seek to not just respect but uphold the human rights of people across the country. And we will always take extremely seriously anything that the Scottish Human Rights Commission says, and we will pay very careful and close attention to the report that Richard Leonard has referred to. It is critical that people's social care support is maintained. We are already working with local authorities, with health and social care partnerships to assure people that any temporary changes that were essential and inevitable as a result of COVID should not become long-term. But it is important to stress that for wider safety reasons, some of those changes in the short term were unavoidable. But it's critical that changes to support arrangements are discussed with the person affected, with unpaid carers, and the impact and duration considered very carefully. And we continue to work not just with local authorities but with Scottish Care and others to address those concerns. So all of these matters, the Health Secretary attends to these matters on a literally daily basis. And as we continue to go through what continues to be a very challenging and difficult situation, we will strive to ensure that the rights and the circumstances of the most vulnerable in our society are absolutely at the centre of all of our decision making.
Question number 3, Patrick Harvie.
The Scottish Greens have consistently supported a strong public health response to COVID and action to make sure the pandemic doesn't deepen the inequality that already exists in our society. Right now, workers across Scotland are faced with financial hardship, job losses and uncertainty, especially in hospitality businesses, which even before the pandemic already suffered from endemic low pay, insecure contracts and poor working conditions. This is Challenge Poverty Week, and today we're all being asked to step up on action to achieve fair work practices. The STUC and Unite have already reported that some employers are asking staff to take unpaid leave, and one notorious Glasgow employer, the G1 Group, is trying to present this to staff as an opportunity. The Scottish Government's £40 million fund is welcome, and the First Minister has said it will be used to meet employer contributions to furlough. If that's the case, how many full-pay jobs will this amount protect, and does it match the scale of need that exists in the businesses affected by these new restrictions?
First Minister.
We are having discussions, as I indicated a few moments ago, with stakeholders. Fergus Ewan's been having these discussions. We hope to announce detail of how the £40 million will be allocated shortly. Our current expectation is that the funding will be distributed through a two-tier support system, that we would look at grants for affected businesses based on rateable values, but also that we would look to deploy a discretionary fund for businesses impacted by the restrictions, even if they're not being required to close. That is similar to the approach that was taken back in August in Aberdeen. I think it's also broadly similar to schemes that are intended to be used elsewhere in the UK. What I would say, though, in terms of furlough is about to end. That's not a decision of the Scottish Government. It's a decision we very much regret and still hope will be reversed. And the support that the Government gives through the furlough scheme is also less than it was back when businesses in Aberdeen had to close. So for that reason, we will be discussing with the sector how the financial support the Scottish Government is making available can provide a contribution towards these costs. But I'm going to be really frank here. We have dug as deep as we can within the finite budget that the Scottish Government has at its disposal to make this £40 million available. We cannot plug all of the gaps that are the responsibility of the UK Government, and support for employment. Employment is a reserved matter, and support that has been given, and very welcome it has been through the furlough scheme. We will do our best to mitigate the impact of deficiencies there, but what we really need to see is action from the UK Government to replace that scheme properly, and also to put in proper schemes that enable the Scottish Government or the Welsh or Northern Irish Government or the UK Government to properly compensate any businesses that unavoidably have to close as a result of the ongoing COVID challenge.
Patrick Harvie.
Both governments clearly need to provide the support that's necessary over the coming weeks. But however well or badly we manage to support people in this period of additional restrictions, in the longer term, we will only get the virus back under control if we have robust systems on testing, contact tracing and supporting people to isolate. That's why the review of the testing strategy must be quick, and it must deliver a major increase in testing, including widespread weekly screening of those at highest risk of infection. This afternoon, Parliament will vote on an amendment in the name of my colleague Alison Johnson calling for that, and I hope the First Minister will vote for that. But it's not just testing where the Scottish Government needs to up its game. I'm very concerned by the evidence presented by the Chief Medical Officer yesterday that more than 3/4 of those who should be self-isolating are not. The self-isolation support grant is due to come in on Monday, but the criteria are incredibly narrow. It's unlikely to reach many of those who need it, particularly those in insecure work. So the Government must make it easy for people to self-isolate. What action will the First Minister take to ensure that everybody has the support that they need to stay at home when they're asked to, and will she make the grant available to everyone who needs it?
First Minister.
The Government does not have the financial wherewithal to make the grant available to everyone, but we are targeting the support that is available at those who are most likely to need it, those who are on low incomes and who are most likely to lose income if they are asked to self-isolate. And that is important. Again, I would hope that we will see over the next period through UK government funding streams, more funding become available. We will use the funding we have at our disposal to help as many people as possible. Financial support is important. That's why we've put this scheme in place, but so too is the broader practical support we offer. And we are also working with local authorities to make sure that anybody who is asked to self-isolate gets an offer of practical help. Many people who perhaps don't need financial support will need help and support with some of the practical implications of not being able to leave their house. So we want to do that as well. And we have to continue, and this will be an ongoing process, which frankly every member of this chamber has a part to play in helping with, to get across to people the importance of self-isolation, why it is so vital in breaking the chains of transmission that happens, and also what self-isolation entails. And that is a job that the government has prime responsibility over, but I hope every party and every member of the chamber would help in that, in the communications they have with their own constituents and supporters.
Thank you. Question 4, Willie Rennie.
The aim of Test and Protect is to protect the country from a second peak. The words of the First Minister in May when she launched the programme. Back then, 77 people tested positive. It's now, as of today, 1,027, when we were supposed to be heading towards elimination. In June, she said the purpose of the elimination strategy was to get more normality back and deal with any flare-ups or clusters or outbreaks in a much more targeted way. But now, as of yesterday, we have limits on travel, pubs and restaurants forced to close, the rule of 6, no indoor visiting, no bingo, no bowling. That doesn't seem like a targeted approach. I think it's clear now that the government got carried away with its language over the summer. The First Minister did not use that time well to prepare adequately. So what would she have done differently to get on top of the virus over the summer?
First Minister.
No doubt when I look back on this episode, and we do it regularly, there's all sorts of things that we would do differently if we had our time again. That's probably in the nature of dealing with an unprecedented challenge. But I just fundamentally disagree with Willie Rennie's characterisation. It was absolutely right. It was not about getting carried away. It was essential over the summer that we used that time to drive the virus as low as possible. Because if we hadn't done that, then we would see levels of infection right now. And, you know, it's always difficult to be trying to prove a negative. We would be seeing levels of infection right now that were way out way above what we are seeing already. If you look at the figures across the UK right now, we have an R number that appears, and R numbers are not perfect ways of describing what's happening with the virus, but we've got an R number that is marginally above other parts of the UK, and we have a growth rate that is marginally above other parts of the UK. But our case numbers per 100,000 on both a 7-day and 14-day rolling average are the lowest in the UK. And that is actually the benefit of having driven the virus low. So even although the virus is spreading again, it is doing it from a much lower base. And again, Test and Protect will never, and Willie Rennie, I'm sure if he goes back and mines my quotes, as he's obviously been done, he will find many times where I've said this, Test and Protect cannot suppress the virus on its own. Right now, it will be bearing, and again, we don't see this because it's preventing lots of cases that are not there right now because of the work it's doing. It's bearing a lot of the strain of this, but unfortunately, with an infectious virus, we all have to play our part, and that's what we are all being asked to do, and it is really difficult for everybody. I absolutely recognise, but that is in the nature of what we're dealing with right now, and it's what every country in the world virtually is having to do. And while, as I said yesterday, this is really difficult, I think, for all of us to really think about right now, because life still feels so abnormal, but we are living with much more normality now than we were in April, May, June, even into July. In many ways, aspects of our life is returned, but there are still restrictions on our life because of the pandemic that we are dealing with. So I absolutely understand people's frustrations. I share those frustrations, but we are in this situation in common with everybody across the world, and we have to keep doing the right things to get ourselves through it, and that's what the government has to continue to lead.
Willie Rennie.
If the government is to get on top of this virus, we need to be frank about what has happened. Test and Protect has not protected us from a second peak, and it has not, and the elimination strategy has not succeeded. But let me turn to something that could help. At Northumbria University in England, they carried out mass testing of students. Last week, they found 90% of those who tested positive showed no symptoms. That's 9 out of 10 did not know that they had the disease. They and their contracts are now self-isolating to stop the spread and get the virus under control. So far, the Scottish Government has refused to embrace this approach. But with this evidence from Northumbria, I want to try again. Will the First Minister agree to mass routine testing for students so we can stop further outbreaks in our universities?
First Minister.
Can I firstly just come back to Test and Protect, because I'm conscious right now there are lots and lots of people across this country working in Test and Protect doing exceptional work, and I don't want to have a statement left hanging that says Test and Protect is not protecting the country. Test and Protect cannot suppress this virus on its own, but the work of Test and Protect right now is preventing countless infections. That will be saving countless numbers of people from becoming ill and potentially countless numbers of people from dying. Those working in Test and Protect are doing an excellent job, and I think we should all be deeply grateful to them for that. It's also, Willie Rennie and I will no doubt continue. I think Willie Rennie, who's a really smart, intelligent guy, don't quote me on that in your next election leaflet, I'll deny it, to the end of days, I think in some respects is choosing not to understand the elimination strategy point, but we will no doubt continue to debate these things, and both of us enjoy it. I'm not sure it helps anybody watching out there. But on the point about testing, we do more asymptomatic testing. Our testing, and again, I mean this with the greatest of respect, the testing strategy will develop in line with the proper consideration and clinical advice that we have. The latest review, as I said yesterday, will be carried out over the next couple of weeks. And we will look at where it is sensible to take asymptomatic testing next. We've already extended that to care homes, to NHS staff, and that discussion will continue. But what I would say is the university outbreaks we have had, and I'm not complacent about this, our data right now shows that the impact of those is beginning to abate. So the work that Test and Protect has been doing through university outbreaks, again, has been helping to contain those outbreaks from getting greater. So I'll take Willie Rennie's points about testing, and I can assure him that we will continue to consider his points as we will consider those that others make to us.
Thank you. Question 5 from Fulton MacGregor, who joins us remotely. Fulton MacGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister whether she will provide an update on discussions with the UK Government regarding support for sporting organisations most affected by a delay to the return of spectators.
First Minister.
Joe Fitzpatrick, the Sports Minister, met with his counterpart in the UK Government on Friday, the 2nd of October, last Friday, that would be to discuss financial aid for sporting organisations that are most affected by the delay in the return of spectators to stadiums. Those discussions are ongoing. We don't yet have confirmation of any proposals that would lead to Barnett consequential funding for us, but we will continue to pursue those constructively. The Sports Minister also met with footballing authorities this week, and we will continue to engage and work with them to ensure that we provide whatever support is possible.
Fulton MacGregor.
There have been numerous suggestions this week in football circles that the decision to exclude fans from football matches is in some way a political decision rather than a scientific one. Could the First Minister share the advice in which this unfortunate but necessary restriction is based? And does the FM also agree with me that football and all sports clubs at all levels play vital roles in our communities, far beyond the activity itself, And will the government continue to look to think of other solutions to survive this tough time, such as live streaming, for example? And will she confirm that supporters will be allowed back when it is possible, but only when it is safe to do so?
First Minister.
I think what confused me about that statement is I can't work out what the political motivation would be. We all want life back to normal, and that includes spectators back in stadiums. Plenty of my supporters are enthusiastic football fans. I've got a father who asks me literally every night on the telephone when he's going to get back to watch Ayr United play. Why he is so desperate, I'm not sure. But people want to get back to normal. And the idea that I've got any sort of political motivation to prevent that happening, I think is just a bit of an odd thing to suggest. Jason Leach has addressed this issue over the course of this week, and I'll summarise the position here. There is, in a pandemic of an infectious virus, when we're trying to keep that virus under control, there is only so much normal activity that brings people together that we can bear without that virus then getting out of control, because it spreads, and this is obviously relevant to the discussions on hospitality, it spreads through human contact, and we have to be very careful about the different circumstances, not just individually but collectively, of the ways in which we are enabling people to come together and potentially spread the virus. So we continue to take these decisions as carefully as possible, and going back to what I said earlier, trying to strike as good a balance as we can in a situation where there is not ever a perfect balance to be found. And we'll continue to discuss with the football authorities how we can best support them in that. All of us, me included, want to see football, all sport and all of society get back to normal just as quickly as we possibly can.
Question number 5, Liam Kerr. 6, sorry, Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to statistics stating that attacks on emergency workers have risen approximately 6% on the previous year and occur at a rate of more than 20 a day.
First Minister.
Any act of violence or aggression towards emergency workers is completely unacceptable, and I was very concerned by the report. We have, some time ago, extended the Emergency Workers Act to cover GPs, other doctors, nurses and midwives whenever they are working in the community. And the NHS Charter for Patients' Rights and Responsibilities makes clear that any abusive, violent or aggressive behaviour towards staff when people are using NHS services may be subject to legal action. We're absolutely committed to improving staff safety and ensuring that all instances of violence and aggression are reported so that perpetrators can be held to account. Nobody should face abuse or violence while at work, and our courts have extensive powers to deal robustly with those who carry out attacks on emergency workers.
Liam Kerr.
I thank the First Minister for that answer, but despite a rise of over 1,000 attacks since 2014-15, court proceedings have plummeted by 55% over the same time period. Why is that? And what is the Scottish Government doing right now to address that statistic?
First Minister.
As Liam Kerr will appreciate, I don't take decisions, and nor should I take decisions on which cases that are prosecuted and which cases are not. That is a matter for Crown Office and prosecutors, and nor do I take the decisions on the disposal of cases that come to court. What my responsibility is, and the Government's responsibility, is to ensure that we have the right legal framework in place. I've already mentioned the Emergency Workers Act and the extension. I think I was Health Secretary when we extended the Emergency Workers Act to make sure that the courts have the right mechanisms in place to deal robustly with these cases. And I say very openly, if there are members across the Chamber who think there are further changes to that legal framework that Parliament should make, then we would be very open to considering that. I think, and again, I'll be corrected if I'm wrong here, but I think when the Emergency Workers Act first went through Parliament, the Scottish Conservatives at the time actually voted against it. So I would hope now that there would be more of a constructive willingness there to consider how we improve that legal framework. I think all of us would want to agree here that abuse of or attacks on emergency workers at any time is completely unacceptable and, in my view, utterly inexplicable. But particularly at this time, when so many of our emergency workers are working so hard to help keep the rest of us safe, we should all be united in sending out a very clear message about how completely unacceptable that is.
Question number 7, Pauline McNeill.
To ask the First Minister how the Scottish Government plans to meet its interim child poverty targets, given that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation report published this week says that it's not on course to meet them?
Minister.
Well, we're determined to continue to progress towards and to meet our child poverty targets, because they are obviously incredibly important for the reasons everybody understands. It will be challenging to do in the face of continued welfare cuts by the UK Government, by the economic impacts of COVID, and of course the potential looming before us of the end of the Brexit transition period. But that makes the action we take here all the more important. That is why we are prioritising, even amidst the COVID challenge, the delivery of the Scottish Child Payment that opens for applications next month. It's estimated that just under 200,000 children could benefit from that, and taken together with the Best Start grant and the Best Start Foods support payment, this will provide an eligible two-child family with financial support worth around £10,000 in the early years of their children's lives. I would want to call on the UK Government to take a similar approach in the short term. They could take a decision to retain the £20 uplift to universal credit and extend that to legacy benefits. That would make a big difference, and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation noted that alongside our new payment for under sixes, that could help us lift 25,000 children out of poverty.
Polly McNeill.
I thank the First Minister for her answer, but she will know that 24% of children in Scotland are growing up in poverty, and that's an increase in 5 years ago, and the target was to reduce this number by a quarter down to 18% by March 2024. So I hope she agrees with me that we do need to make a bigger effort to try and meet that target. But I specifically wanted to ask the First Minister about single parents, because they are double the number of single-parent families that are in poverty compared with two-parent families. And recently, Glasgow City Council withdrew funding from one-parent families, but it's the only dedicated single-parent support service. But the First Minister will know that in the Child Poverty Act, there's a specific target on single parents. And I wonder if the First Minister would be prepared to remind local authorities like Glasgow that there is a specific target there for single parents. And if we're going to join up an anti-poverty policy, then they've really got to reconsider a decision like this. And if the First Minister can add anything else to that, about what specific policies are going to be aimed at single-parent families.
First Minister.
I think the point about single-parent families is important. Obviously, it's for local authorities to take their decisions, but I would hope and believe that all local authorities share the determination the Scottish Government has to implement the Child Poverty Action Plan and to meet those targets that we have spoken about. Obviously, some of the policies that I've already talked about, the Scottish Child Payment in particular, will benefit single-parent families as it will other families. I'm happy to write to the member with detail of the specific policies that the Scottish Government is and will in the future pursue, specifically geared towards single-parent families. I don't think there is anybody in this chamber that would say anything other than meeting these targets is absolutely essential and a priority. Poverty level, my view, and I'm sure it's the view of Paul McNeill and others, one child living in poverty is one too many. Poverty levels in Scotland are lower than in other parts of the UK, but still too high. It's important that we do everything we can to tackle child poverty. I think we are, although we are always open to doing more where that is possible. But we have to recognise that there are many of the levers that impact on child poverty that are out with our hands. Welfare cuts, the austerity agenda we've seen in years gone by, these all have a massive impact on our ability to meet these targets, and I would hope that certainly from this side of the chamber we would get support in asking for different policies, but more fundamentally than that, asking for these decisions to lie with this Parliament and not with the Conservatives in Westminster.
Thank you. We'll move to open supplementaries. First question from Stuart McMillan, to be followed by Peter Chapman. Stuart McMillan.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware of the news that broke last weekend about ITU at Inverclyde Royal Hospital. The Health Board have now clarified to me that the unit itself has not been closed, but the process for transferring the most unwell patients to the Queen Elizabeth in Glasgow, which equated to 9 patients throughout COVID, has been formalised. The inappropriate manner in which this news was conveyed to both staff and the public has caused a great deal of justifiable anger and concern to the people of my community who rely on these vital services. And had the NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde conveyed these changes in a transparent and a clear communication strategy, both internal and external, much of this anger and worry would have been avoided. I would ask the First Minister, therefore, if she can confirm that the future of the IRH is not in doubt, and providing assurance that the ITU service will remain at the Inverclyde Royal Hospital?
First Minister.
Can I, well, firstly, make two initial points. Firstly, to thank Stuart McMillan for raising this issue. He is a dedicated champion of Inverclyde Royal Hospital as the constituency MP, and I know his constituents will be grateful to him for that. Secondly, the points about communication I think are well made, and I'm sure these are points that the Health Secretary will pass on to the Health Board. I'm sure the Health Board will hear them here themselves. But most importantly, on the substance, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde has given assurances that the critical care unit at the IRH is not closing. Both the Government and Greater Glasgow and Clyde Board have been consistently clear in our commitment to the continued provision of comprehensive hospital, community and primary care services across Inverclyde, including Inverclyde Royal Hospital. The intensive care unit beds at our IRH will remain open, and patients will continue to be admitted to the beds, assessed and stabilised. The high dependency unit and coronary care unit will continue to treat patients at Inverclyde Royal, as is the case at present. And when a patient no longer needs critical care support, they will transfer back to the IRH for their continued recovery and rehabilitation.
Thank you. Peter Chapman, to be followed by Jackie Bailey. Peter Chapman.
Thank you. Presiding Officer, I've read this morning with utter disbelief that Trade Minister Ivan McKee yesterday suggested in Parliament that he might reject the opportunity of free ports being set up in Scotland. I can tell the First Minister there are several ports in the North East that are very interested in becoming free ports, which could turbocharge these ports and greatly boost local economies. So does the First Minister support this reckless position and this total lack of ambition for the Scottish economy?
First Minister.
I think that's a complete mischaracterisation of the position, but we'll put that to one side. Firstly, I don't think free ports are any substitute to being a full member of the single market, which of course is what the Conservatives are ripping us out of against our will. And, you know, let the Conservatives come forward and tell us what exactly they mean about free ports, how they're going to work, whether they are anything other than just a race to the bottom. And, of course, we will listen and support anything that is in the interests of Scotland. But what is absolutely against the interests of Scotland right now is the Tory obsession with Brexit, the determination to drag us out of the single market, drag us out of the European Union, potentially leave the transition period with no deal. I think the Conservatives should really have a long, hard look at themselves in terms of Scotland's trading position before levelling any accusations at the Scottish Government.
Jackie Bailey, to be followed by Annabel Ewing. Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, there are cafes in my constituency and across Loch Lomond and the Trossachs National Park that have a licence. They will be forced to close their doors as a result of the new restrictions, but the reality is 99% of what they do is about food and only 1% is about alcohol. So can I ask the First Minister to consider whether there is a way of allowing these cafes to suspend their licences and continue to trade offering just food? Otherwise, they may have to close their doors permanently.
First Minister.
No, I won't consider it in the future, because I already have, and I'm delighted Jackie Bailey has given me the opportunity to clarify this point today. Cafes will be able to open whether they are licensed or unlicensed, as long as they don't serve alcohol. The regulations that we will shortly bring forward to close certain premises will include a specific exemption for cafes. These regulations will be published tomorrow. Of course, environmental health officers will be responsible for ensuring these regulations are adhered to. So I hope that is something that Jackie Bailey will welcome.
Annabel Ewing, to be followed by Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware of the further unplanned flaring at Musmoran, resulting in over 56 hours of hell for my constituents, who are not just fed up and worried, but are increasingly very angry. For the future, a just transition for Musmoran will be essential, but dealing with the here and now, can I urge the First Minister to have the Scottish Government consider all available options to bring such blatant disregard by the operator for the interests of the local community to an end?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, can I say I completely understand the community concerns in relation to this issue, and I understand the frustration and anger that people in the local community will feel, and I can hear it expressed on their behalf by Annabel Ewing today. It is entirely understandable, and in my view it's entirely legitimate. SEPA is currently looking at the cause of the flaring and how it was managed over the full duration of the incident. The concerns locally are clear and well understood both by government and regulators, and of course the Crown Office is currently considering a report submitted by SEPA into a previous incident of flaring, and I won't say any more about that for obvious reasons, but I hope it is an indication of the seriousness with which SEPA is treating flaring incidents at the plant. That is what is underway, but I will end by giving Annabel Ewing an assurance that of course we will continue to consider all options and be open to discussing them with her on behalf of our constituents.
Jamie Green to be followed by Anas Sarwar. Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Further to the comments made by Mr Macmillan, the Greenock Telegraph today has launched a campaign to save the ICU unit, and I'm careful with my language here. I'm talking about the intensive care capability of its critical care unit, not the entire unit. The campaign page has already had 10,000 signatures. It has my backing, and I hope the backing of every party in this chamber. The campaign page says, "The First Minister made a commitment to this paper that Inverclyde Royal would be protected. We now call on her to make good on that promise." The question is, First Minister, will you?
First Minister.
I think I've just made that very clear in response to Stuart Macmillan. We are absolutely clear in our commitment to the continued provision of comprehensive services across Inverclyde. I've already said that. I've already said the intensive care unit beds will remain open. Patients from Inverclyde will continue to be admitted to these beds, assessed and stabilised. The high dependency unit, the coronary care unit will continue to treat patients at Inverclyde Royal Hospital, as is the case at present. I understand absolutely the concern that local people will have when there is ever any threat or perceived threat to local services, which is why I agree with Stuart Macmillan that it's important the NHS board here, or in any case, communicates clearly to local residents. But the commitment to the IRH is there, it's clear, and this government stands by it.
Anas Sarwar to be followed by Maureen Watt. Anas Sarwar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister is a better communicator than Boris Johnson, and I think everyone in Scotland will say thank goodness for that. But the rise in cases in the last 2 weeks shows that an effective communication strategy is not the same as a virus elimination strategy. I support us trying to beat the virus, but I do genuinely fear that parts of our response to the virus may lead to more deaths than the virus itself. Pausing of cancer services being one example, thousands of operations being cancelled, or indeed the lockdown or further restrictions, the impact that will have on people's mental health, worried about their job, worried about their businesses. I understand there will be assessments being done about the COVID impact by all these measures. But is there a health impact assessment being done on the long-term health of Scotland of these measures and our response? And if there is, will the First Minister publish that information? And if there's not, why not? And will she commit to do that assessment now?
First Minister.
We assess all of our decisions against the 4 harms that were set out in one of the early papers we published about how we would chart our way through the pandemic. And we have published analysis of that, and I will look on an ongoing basis at what more we publish. But I want to give an assurance to the Chamber that we don't just look at the direct impact of COVID, although anybody, and I'm not suggesting for a minute Anas Sarwar is doing this, but anybody who suggests that that shouldn't be a real priority, I think is wrong. We need to have that very high up in our minds. I was looking at a report from the ONS about England and Wales this morning, showing the relative number of deaths from COVID versus flu, and I think puts paid to this argument that COVID is no worse than flu. So we can't take our eye off that, but Anas Sarwar is right. There are other things that we have to look at and assess, and that is what makes, I said this yesterday, if the decision we reached yesterday had been purely about the COVID impact, we would undoubtedly have gone much further in closing the country down to stop COVID in its tracks. But it is not that simple or one-dimensional. So we have to assess the economic impacts, because impact on jobs, impacts on people's health and well-being, and of course the impact on wider health issues. And part of the reason for trying to continue to suppress the virus is so that we don't have to pause things again in the NHS to free up capacity for, obviously we need capacity for COVID, but we want to make sure we've got that balance right. So what I'm not going to say is that there is a perfect balance to be struck here in a situation like this. Every decision we are taking is balancing different harms and trying to minimise it overall. But it is not the case, and it cannot be the case, it is one-dimensional. That possibly was the case back in March when just shut everything down to stop COVID. That cannot be the case 7 months in, and therefore we will try to make sure that all of our decisions are assessed by that wider impact across all of these different factors.
Maureen Watt, to be followed by Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Following the very heavy rainfall over the weekend, especially in the east and northeast, can the First Minister give us an assurance that all the necessary safety checks are being carried out on Scotland's rail and road network?
First Minister.
Well, this is obviously an extremely important issue given recent events, and Maureen Watt is right to raise it. Due to the severe weather that was forecast for the 3rd and 4th of October, an emergency rail passenger service timetable was implemented. That resulted in a blanket speed restriction of 40 miles per hour and a controlled close down on the east and north of the country. Once the weather had passed, the impacted routes were checked using empty trains to ensure that the lines were safe for passenger services to resume. Trunk roads also have weekly safety inspections and patrols to identify defects or hazards, which are then repaired by operating companies within strict timescales. And following Saturday's heavy rainfall, special inspections were undertaken in structures known to be susceptible to scour, but no issues were identified. And the inspection and maintenance of local roads is, of course, the responsibility of local authorities.
Brian Whittle, to be followed by Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, many sports clubs and organisations have gone to extraordinary lengths to make their training and participating areas COVID safe, and I know the club that I coach at are managing their training regime like an SAS operation. I accept, of course, that my sport is easier to maintain social distancing because we have lanes, of course, but the concern with the kids that at the club is what they are training for, and sport is a lot about competition. So can I ask the First Minister what work is being done with the Sport Scotland and the governing bodies to maximise the opportunities for competition in a safe COVID environment?
The Government is working with Sport Scotland, with a whole range of agencies and different organisations across the country to try to, as far as possible, allow all aspects of our life to operate as normally as possible within a COVID-safe environment. I'll ask the Sports Ministers to write to Brian Whittle, particularly addressing the point about competitive sport and the actions that can be taken there. I absolutely recognise, going back to Anna Sarwar's question about the wider health and mental health well-being of the country, that physical activity and sport is really important to have operating as normally as possible. But unfortunately, in everything, we have to take account of the wider issues and the bigger perspective. And, it's always easy. I, find myself doing this as well and trying to manage our way through this situation of focusing on the things that we don't want to be affected. All of us can do that, and all of us have things that we would prioritise if we could, but we have to have that balanced decision. But sport is important, and I'll ask the Sports Minister to give more detail on the specific question raised.
Colin Smith, to be followed by Willie Coffey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In May, I asked the First Minister that given the decision to develop different COVID-19 phone apps in different parts of the UK, would they be compatible with each other? And the First Minister answered yes. Well, that hasn't happened. 5 months on, the Scottish Test and Protect app doesn't work in England, and the thousands of my constituents who travel south of the border every day can't use the English app properly when in England because it doesn't recognise a Scottish postcode. First Minister, why has the disconnect between the UK and the Scottish Government allowed this basic failing in any credible test and trace system to happen, and when exactly will it be fixed?
First Minister.
Work is ongoing on this. Look, you recall back at a much earlier stage in this pandemic, I think I probably said it in the Chamber, it was never our intention to establish a separate Scottish proximity tracing app. We wanted to have the UK-wide one. Unfortunately, the UK-wide one didn't happen on the timescales that were predicted, and there was a period where we didn't really know whether it would ever happen. So we took a decision once the Republic of Ireland had successfully launched theirs, that Northern Ireland used that same one, that actually we would just go on and get that operational, and we've done that, and that's been very successful. And to people watching, if you haven't yet downloaded Protect Scotland, please do so. There is work ongoing now that the England and Wales one has launched to get the interoperability issues fixed. I hope that will happen soon. I think it is likely to happen sooner than that there will be interoperability between the Scottish and Northern Irish ones, because we are using the same software and is part of a federated system. So that work is underway and will be completed as quickly as possible. But the only alternative to getting our own app up and running would have been to wait for one that we really didn't know was ever going to materialise, and I don't think that would have been the right thing to do.
Willie Coffey, to be followed by Mark Ruskell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In light of Peter Chapman's outrageous comments on the future of 300 direct jobs at Prestwick Airport and countless other associated jobs, and Ayrshire Tory councillor Tom Marshall, who called for it to be shut altogether, does the First Minister agree that this displays a callous disregard for the Scottish aviation industry and is further proof that the Tories can't be trusted to stand up for Scottish workers?
First Minister.
I think the notion that Conservatives can't be trusted to stand up for Scottish workers is probably one that would be agreed with by the majority of people across the country, not just by me. There is a wealth of evidence going back for my entire life and probably before that that would prove that point. The aviation sector has been really hard hit by COVID, and that is really difficult for it. It faces possibly one of the longest recovery periods of any sector. We have been providing support to the sector within the powers available to us, including rates relief for airports and ground handling providers, and we're also working with Scotland's airports to help them rebuild route networks and return to growth. But I don't underestimate the impact of the decisions we've had to take on that sector and all different aspects of that sector. In relation to Mr Chapman's comments, we should all remember this is a difficult time for those who've lost jobs in the sector and an uncertain time for those still working in aviation, aerospace and travel. And I would encourage everybody, all of us without exception, because we can all be guilty sometimes of these things, but we should all the time right now show understanding and empathy as businesses try to respond to the current challenges and take tough decisions to ensure their recovery.
Mark Ruskell, to be followed by Liam MacArthur. Mark Ruskell.
Presiding Officer, I listened very carefully to the answer that the First Minister gave previously about Mossmorran flaring. But the fact is that there will be many live investigations into the flaring continuing for the foreseeable future, and communities can't wait for these to end. They want to see change, and they want to see a just transition at the plant. So can I ask the First Minister, what message does she have for the 5,500 people who've written to Rosanna Cunningham calling for an inquiry into the crumbling plant?
First Minister.
My message to people is I absolutely understand their views, frustration and anger over this. I said to Annabel Ewing, the government is willing to look at all options. If Mark Ruskell wants to be part of that conversation, I would very much welcome that. I will, as a result of his question, have a further discussion with Rosanna Cunningham about the call for an inquiry and about the action that any further action we can take or support or encourage SEPA to take. It's not any help to people who are living with this. I understand that. For me to say I understand what they're saying. But there are processes, legal processes that we cannot simply cast aside, both from SEPA and from the Crown Office. But beyond those processes, if there is further work we can do, particularly looking ahead to the very legitimate issue of just transition, then we are very keen to do that. And I know, as somebody who has a very genuine and long-standing interest in this issue, Mark Ruskell will be keen to be part of that.
And Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yesterday, the First Minister acknowledged that neither Orkney nor Shetland has a rising number of COVID cases, but added even they have had cases in recent weeks. My understanding is that there have been 5 recent cases in Orkney. 2 turned out to be false positives. The other 3 relate to Orkney students who became infected, self-isolated and remain in other parts of Scotland. I'm also told there's been no community transmission of COVID in Orkney since April. Yet the restrictions announced by the First Minister 3 weeks ago apply every bit as much in Orkney as they do in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And yesterday's statement offered islanders no respite from those restrictions, which are clearly taking a toll on people's health as well as jobs and businesses. So can the First Minister advise my constituents why more account is not being taken of local circumstances and relative risks?
First Minister.
Can I assure Liam MacArthur and his constituents that we do take great account of this. The Islands Ministers had discussions in recent days with island authorities, and we are willing to continue to have a discussion to see if there is a different balance that might be struck for islands in particular. When I had a call earlier this week with the party leaders, not specifically in the context of islands, but more generally, we had a discussion, as Richard Leonard will recall, about the balance we're trying to strike between nationwide restrictions to avoid travel restrictions or more localised restrictions that would probably necessitate travel restrictions. And this is, I'm open to discussion on this, because it's one of these things where I think you can argue both ways. So, for example, if we were to, and I'm happy to have this discussion with the local authorities in Orkney, if we were to say Orkney, if it doesn't have cases, can be exempt from national restrictions, probably the quid pro quo of that, though, would be travel restrictions from the mainland to Orkney. Now, you know, it's not for me alone to say what the islanders would prefer there, but it's for me to be frank about the choices and the trade-offs that have to be made. So what I would say in all, in sincerity, is that we are happy to have those discussions on an ongoing basis with the islands. We have had a significant outbreak in the Western Isles in recent days. There have been cases in Orkney, although I absolutely take Liam MacArthur's point about the circumstances, and there have been cases. In fact, one of the early outbreaks around COVID was in Shetland. So these are not easy issues, but if there are different ways of protecting our island communities, we are open to them. But what I won't do stand here and do is pretend that that is just an easy or straightforward. There will always be trade-offs in how we deal with it. But I'd be very happy to have the Islands Minister follow up with Liam MacArthur and the other Islands MSPs to see whether there is a different way that they would be interested in pursuing.
Thank you very much, and apologies to those MSPs I couldn't call, but that concludes the First Minister's questions. We're going to suspend Parliament until 2:30. Parliament is suspended. I just actually urge members to be careful leaving the chamber and just to observe social distancing, particularly down the steps, following the one-way systems. Thank you.
How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a balanced stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.